And for those who haven't attended those, it's a great opportunity to share some of your images, kind of give the story behind how you took those, what your thoughts were, and get a little bit of discussion in that with other members in that in terms of suggestions and that. So again, real good opportunity for learning, and that is on June 2nd. June 16th, we have Joseph Roybal. He'll be presenting color theory for landscape photography. In July, I should have the dates down for this, but I don't. But we have the scavenger hunt. This is something that we've done the last couple of years. Bruce has done a really good job of arranging a scavenger hunt. It's a really fun event, but it also is fun to get creative with the post-processing and that of whatever images that you happen to come across while you're looking for the items that are on the scavenger hunt list. So again, a real fun club event that we've done the last couple of years. So look forward to doing that in July. August 18th, we have Tim Gray is going to be presenting on PhotoPills. For those who aren't familiar with that, PhotoPills is a phone app that's really useful for landscape and night photography, establishing sun positions, moon positions, hyperfocal information, long exposure calculations. So this one is going to be structured as a webinar in which we'll be using his platform, but we'll still do our pre-meeting in that for that first 30 minutes, and then we'll jump over to his platform. And then there'll still be a Q&A session that will be at the end of that. So that is on August 18th. September 1st, we will have another competition. September 15th, we're going to have our 2020 Photographers of the Year award winners, Ashley and Carino, to present on how their rapid growth to success in photography. Again, we mentioned this before, but they both won that award last year after only 2 years, I guess a little bit less than 2 years of photography experience, and obviously came out with some really good images. So they're going to share some of their secrets as to how they learned it so quickly. And then we'll be continuing to work on arranging some other programs that we'll have later on in the last quarter of the year. So now to tonight's presenter, we have, thank you again, Alyce Bender. She is a photographer currently based in, I had to change my notes on this one, San Antonio. That was, I guess it was Las Vegas up until just a few months ago. She's also is a self-labeled outgoing, outdoorsy adventurous who enjoys solo explorations. She has a background with the US Air Force, as a US Air Force veteran. So there again, thank you for your service. Also want to acknowledge, I know Elaine, and we probably have a couple of others here who are veterans of the military. So again, thank you all for your service with that. And it was in the Air Force that she actually developed a passion for travel, gave her the opportunity to pursue her love for photography that began, the photography part of it began in early childhood days, but it really came together with the travel through the military opportunities. She and her husband were fortunate to spend 2 years in Japan. We already heard her just mention that a few minutes ago. And she developed a strong connection with the culture there, nature and wildlife. And each year, I don't know if she was able to here during the COVID year, but each year tries to make a return visit to, again, photograph their nature and culture. Following the 2 years stay in Japan, she chose to make photography her first full-time profession. And that included a 10-month tour throughout the desert Southwest in an RV. And it sounds like she continues to visit many of those places all the way up until now. She's also a pro ambassador for Tamron USA. Her images have been featured in galleries throughout the world. Her work has also been featured in various publications, including Outdoor Photographer, Tamron Magazine, Nampa Expressions, excuse me, Landscape Photography Magazine, and Wild Planet Photography Magazine. She enjoys presenting to various photography groups. So again, thank you for joining our group tonight, and also teaching at national photographic conferences. Common to all of her accomplishments is her love of nature and desire to promote environmental awareness and connect viewers and photographers with the natural world through her imagery and tours and workshops. So with that, I'll go ahead and I'll open it up to see if anybody else has any questions regarding any of the club events that are coming up. And if not, we'll go ahead and turn it over and for Alyce, excuse me, to give her presentation. I also did put out there on the chat a link to her website. There's a spot there to subscribe to her newsletters and plenty of other information with regards to other tours and so forth that she has.
Thank you so very much, Michael, for that great intro. And if you don't see it in the chat, or if you want to wait until the end of the presentation, I'll have my up at the end as well. So again, thank you all so much for inviting me, because this is the part that I love about my job. You know, other than being in the field, is being able to come and present to clubs like you all, and bring what I know to you so that you can then further enjoy being outdoors with your camera. So I guess if there aren't any questions for the club, then I'll just delve right into the presentation. And then the only thing I'm going to ask is that we hold questions until the end. I'll go through the presentation, and then I'll take and answer questions until we either run out of time and I'm kicked out, or there's no more questions left. So if that sounds good, I will go ahead and share screen. All right.
We can see your screen.
Awesome. Okay. So at this time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just, let me see, shrink this down. Let's put that in the corner real quick. All right. So again, thank you all so very much for taking time to join me, and I'm excited to hear that it's one of the more attended events, because I think this is going to be a lot of basically breaking all the rules and really playing with your camera. So it might not necessarily be for everyone. And I think I'm going to offer a selection of techniques to use to create these types of images. And so you may like one, you may like multiple, you may not like any of them. But I think it's just something fun to play, that you can play with and really kind of explore a different kind of genre within nature photography. So we're going to go into kind of a background on how I discovered this and where I pull from in order to create images, to give you an idea of where you can look outside of other photographers to find inspiration for this type of photography work. I'm going to cover some of the gear that I use, the techniques used to create impressionistic images, what type of subjects I look for, and kind of give you an idea of, when you're out and about, what to look for that make for good subjects, because not everything is going to work for impressionistic. So how to pre-visualize, and then a few tips on post-processing. Okay. So you all heard that great introduction that Michael did for me. So you know a lot about me and my background in photography. But for this in particular, I really was influenced early on by painters such as Claude Monet and Boudin and Turner, with the Turner, who did like watercolor traces over pencil drawings, and then Thomas Cole and the Hudson River School. So those painters really had an influence on me when I was young. My mother taking me to museums. So those were the paintings I was most drawn to, and still continue to be drawn to when visiting museums. Within photography, there is a woman out of Australia or New Zealand. I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head right now. I'm so sorry. But her name's Eva Polka, and she is a impressionistic photographer. And again, I just was really drawn to her work. I loved her work, and so between those influences of other artists in both photography and other mediums, some of the other influences that came out to bring me to discover this type of photography was one, my mother. I mean, she was a big influence and still is influence because she loves impressionistic paintings. And I can't paint or draw to save my life. And I was really drawn to wanting to create something for her that she would love, and not just because her daughter made it. You know, I wanted her to love it because for what it was, regardless of who created it, kind of thing. The other thing is that I think I was drawn to the impressionistic photography because a lot of it is not straightforward. There's, you know, it's hashtag blur on purpose. My eyesight when I was young, I didn't realize it until I couldn't pass my driver's test exactly how bad my sight was. So I had been seeing for years, I had been seeing the world in a very impressionistic way. And still to this day, if I'm, you know, kind of wondering what a scene might look like and I'm wearing my glasses, I'll just take the glasses off and be like, oh, this is what it might look like for impressionistic work. So to give me some ideas. The other thing is that more recently, I started the work a little bit, but I really was influenced more when I was living in Japan with their culture and art. They have this kind of, I think of it as a cross between watercolor painting and calligraphy, and it's called sume. And the minimalist culture that they have just really kind of struck me. And so I bring a lot of kind of minimalism to the impressionistic to create my photography and give it my own personal flair and personal signature within the work in that way, combining those. So you'll see a lot of very minimalist work throughout this as well. So that's kind of the background where I pull my influences from, what kind of drew me to this, because I think with pieces and art like this that are very personable or personal, I think it's important to know the background and know where the person's coming from, the artist is coming from, as it speaks more to their work. And a bit on gear. So yes, I'm a Tamron Pro ambassador. I've been, I was honored with that title last year, right before going into lockdown, but I've been using Tamron lenses for years and years and years before that. So the nice thing is that with impressionistic work, unlike a lot of other types of photography, there's no specific lens, there's no specific gear. The gear you have, as long as you can adjust the settings manually, you can do impressionistic work with. So I use everything from the Tamron 10 to 24, the 18 to 400, the 90mm macro, 100 to 400, and even my 150 to 600 G2. All of those I have used to create pieces that fit within the impressionistic, abstract impressionistic photography genre. So, and I shoot on crop sensor. So my main body is a Nikon D500. So to give you an idea. But really with the gear, this is not going to be a gear technical type of photography. You really can do it with any camera that you can manually adjust the settings on. All right, so the techniques we're going to talk about that are used to create this type of image. The big one is going to be intentional camera movement, panning, zooming, and what I call snaps in any direction. So intentional camera movement is exactly what it sounds like. It's literally physically moving the camera while it is exposing and doing it intentionally. So these aren't oops photos. These are, you know, you're actually wanting to move the camera during the exposure. We're also going to be talking about long exposures. And for me, when talking about the techniques, I'm defining long exposures as a half second or longer. Okay. Selective focus is a particular technique, defocusing, and then double or multiple exposures. So those are what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to show you examples of all of those and kind of delve into how you use them to create these types of images. So we'll start off with panning, and specifically vertical panning. So this is going to be when you move the camera up or down, and you can do it both ways. I find for me, I get straighter lines when I am dropping the camera, you know, moving it downwards, not actually physically like dropping it to the ground, but moving it downwards. That is until I start getting tired. And then I kind of will start moving it a little off and the lines will kind of go more at a diagonal. And at that time, I will go ahead and move my camera from bottom to top of where I'm wanting my frame. And it gives me a bit more stability because my muscles are having to kind of think about it a bit more to keep it straight. So I put more effort into keeping it straight that way. So that's a trick if you're having difficulty keeping lines straight. So in this situation, this image here, this was taken in a bamboo forest. So this is a piece of bamboo with the others behind it. I really liked this really light colored one. It was a newer shoot. The others in the back were much more weathered. They were dark green and in the shadows, but we had this one bright green one. And so I really wanted to kind of capture that contrast in the colors while keeping the form and structure of the bamboo, those rigid lines. So if you're shooting something like bamboo or a forest and you're having a hard time kind of keeping those trunks straight, if you're trying to either go up or down, try using the reverse method and going in the opposite direction with it. So combining some of these techniques, you go with vertical panning and a long exposure. So in this image here, this was fall colors in the Smoky Mountains. And fall colors have always been kind of elusive to me. I take a forest scene and if I take it in a regular, traditional manner, it just looks very cluttered to me. We all know that forests can be very chaotic and then hard to photograph. And so, but I absolutely love fall colors. You all being in Colorado, I'm sure you agree that fall colors are spectacular. So I was trying to figure out how I could capture the way I felt while walking through fall woods. And to me, by using intentional camera movement, by using the vertical panning in combination with the long exposure, I was really able to capture that feeling of you're in the forest, but you're just enveloped in these, you know, swaths of color. And so in this image, I did a long exposure. So I was at half a second. This was hand holding because I was doing the intentional camera movement. And I started the exposure holding it still. I hit the trigger and then I pulled down rather than starting my movement and hitting the trigger while moving. So playing with when you actually trigger your shutter can give you different results in the final frame. So here I was able to keep a slight bit of that detail before everything washed over it. And here's another one with vertical panning and long exposure. And what I want to do is I'm going to be flipping between this and the next image, because I think this demonstrates, especially if you've never played with intentional camera movement before, this image is going to show you the difference in what the actual physical speed that you move your camera at, how much of a difference that makes. Because you can have your settings all the same. The settings are both exactly the same on these two images. The only difference between the two images is that in this image, I moved the camera physically move the camera panning downward much faster than I did in this image. And I think that from what I've experienced in the field with beginners in this is that you really have to move the camera a lot faster than you anticipate if you're wanting a much creamier image. So be sure if you're going out and playing with vertical panning, horizontal panning, any of these intentional camera movements, make sure you're playing with how much you actually move the camera. You'd be surprised at how much you actually have to move it and how quickly you have to move it in order to get a very soft and dreamy image, if that's the look you're going for. You know, I know people who prefer this actual image because they're like, well, there's more of it that's sharp. I can get more out of it. Whereas I personally prefer this one. So again, playing with the physical speed at which you move your camera is really essential when working with intentional camera movement. Horizontal panning. So this one might look similar because I use this as my background because I just love this image. This was taken out at Bosque del Apache. And what this is snow geese gather by the thousands out there in Bosque. And in the mornings, they will do this large blast off as they all take off into the sky and go to their feeding grounds. Well, the day I was there was a thick fog cover. And so they all went to blast off, but the fog had kind of created a lid over the lake, and it was still touching the tree lines. And so they didn't actually want to fly into the fog bank. So they ended up several times blasting off, getting up, and then settling back down on the water. And because they did this several times, I was able to take the opportunity and do this horizontal panning. So I actually had this set up on a tripod. And when they blasted off, I focused and then panned with the birds. Now I was at a 13th of a second, so that gave me a relatively long period of time for the birds to move and me to move the camera with the birds. So here the key is trying to pan as close to the speed of the birds as you can while keeping that horizon straight. So that's why I used the tripod, because that tripod allowed me to just turn the camera and keep that camera straight and level, keep that horizon level while tracking the birds. So this is another one I did on the tripod, and this is out at Death Valley. So very minimalist. It was one of those sunsets that just color really didn't appear. So it went from like sunset to blue hour in no time. So this is kind of that transition. So you have a few warm colors in the sky, but otherwise it's just blue. And I was out at Badwater Basin, which is Salt Flats. And the Salt Flats, they didn't have that really distinctive line. There had been some moisture there not too long before my visit, but it had dried up, but it wasn't so dry that it had formed those really distinctive hexagonal type shapes that Badwater Flats is known for. So I was trying to figure out, and I really liked the colors. And so I decided to do a horizontal pan. So I rotated the camera on the ball head using a 0.8 of a second, and rotating it so that I keep those valley lines. And I got a sense of the valley by keeping some of those mountains and keeping the sky. But really, it's just kind of this overall arching effect. And I think it's the arch that kind of gives the lines and the textures in the foreground that give it a little extra depth to this image. Now this one may be a little bit trippy. This is not something I do on a regular basis. This is one of those techniques that some people absolutely love. I'm not a huge fan of it, but I tried it out anyways because I like playing with my camera. So what this is it's zooming. So literally you are using a zoom lens. So this won't necessarily work on, this won't work on a prime lens, but you are taking a zoom lens, and when you expose, you turn the barrel either in or out during the exposure. So here, this was a grove of aspens up in the Tetons. And the really interesting part about this aspen grove was that there was this midline in the aspens that there weren't really any leaves. There was leaves on the lower branches and lower area and then on the top, but there was none on the middle portion, which I thought was very weird, but it gave it this kind of two-story thing. So I figured if I did the zooming, it would kind of take all those leaves and kind of allow me to have that blue in the middle and then swirl the gold around. And sure enough, that's what it did. And you can see all the different twigs there in the middle that were left and just end up as little lines through the image. But again, this is because I was just playing with it. So when you see where I put that I was at 155 millimeters plus, that's because I decided I would go from 155 millimeters out to, I think I stopped when the barrel stopped at 400. So, you know, somewhere in there, wherever the exposure, which was at a 1/10 of a second, when that stopped, you know, I turned it very quickly during that time. So, but yeah, it's something, again, to play with. Not necessarily for everyone. I find it's a very trippy picture to me. But I like the colors, the color contrast, and the lines that are still there. So, and then we have this, which I've had a lot of people say kind of looks like some sort of cloth. Is the most frequent one that I get. But this is actually wildflowers. This was taken during the 2019 California poppy super bloom. So the orange you're seeing are California poppies. The blues are various blue wildflowers that grow up within the poppies. And then the green are going to be like your grasses and stems. And I call this a circular series. So this is using circular snaps where you literally take the camera and you move it in a circle. You kind of snap it around in a circle. You can also do snaps, you know, diagonally, however you want, basically moving the camera in a zigzag pattern, however you'd like. But this one I did in a circular pattern. So in moving the camera in a circle while taking a series of images. So I focus, I then just start firing off. So at 1/3 of a second, I probably went through about 8 or 10 different frames as I went in circle with my camera, just holding that trigger down, shooting continuously. And I created this image, and a few frames later, this image. So you can see how very different, even though this was all taken basically at once, because I just held the trigger down, the shutter trigger down, and moved the camera. Because of the movement, it gives me very different images, patterns, from the same scene and within just a few frames of each other. So again, something to play with. All right, so moving out of intentional camera movement, then we go into long exposure, where the camera stays still and your subject moves. And this is probably one that you all are very familiar with. You know, long exposures, we use them a lot when we're shooting waterfalls, when we're shooting astrophotography. This is using those same techniques. We're just focusing on a different aspect of nature in this. So instead of getting the entire waterfall, we're focusing on just the ripples within the water. This is the Colorado River out at Lee's Ferry in the Grand Canyon. And so I had a tributary that was funneling in a bunch of sediments into the deeper, darker waters of the actual Colorado River. And I loved how the color gradient was. I was trying to figure out how I was going to capture it. And so I decided I was going to do a long exposure focusing just on this color gradient. Again, here, take a bunch because as we all know, those little rapids are always changing. So you want to find the one that's most pleasing to the eye when you get back to your desk. You can filter through them and see which one you prefer the most. But I just really liked how, you have this kind of triangle here where the water, the dark water is, then you have this kind of light band that filters through and connects the gradients as it moves up the frame. So yeah, so long exposures. The other one for long exposures, this is going to be at the ocean. So this was a very calm evening on the East Coast outside of Myrtle Beach. And this is the reflected light of the sunset on just the very gentle rolling wave as it came in. A lot of people think that this is either cloth or some sort of film or paper, when really it's ocean wave. Selective focus. Again, this is used a lot in this particular technique is used a lot in macro. Well, here we're going to use it in order to create, using the various layers, we create an impressionistic work intentionally. So here, this was again during the California super bloom, and these flowers that you can kind of see that are in focus right in the middle of the frame, they were on a far hillside. So what I did was where I got down very low into the flowers that were in front of me, and I allowed those flowers to come over in front of my camera lens. Because my focus was on the far flowers and I used a shallow depth of field, the flowers that fell in front of my camera ended up creating these color blurs around the outside edges. And because of that very shallow focus, that aperture of 6.3, the background also fell off very fast. So only those few flowers that I had focused on were actually sharp, and everything in front and behind them fell off to create this very impressionistic piece. This is probably the sharpest images when you get the selective focus out of my impressionistic collection, if you will. Here's another one with selective focus. This is using the Tamron 90mm macro at the 2.8 setting. And so this was handheld. I actually had my husband, we were out walking the dogs when I found this one. This is just a little daisy in the front yard of my neighbor's house. And so I had him stand over me to create some shade to put on it. And I focused just on the very tip of the front petal that's sticking out towards me. I focused on it and allowed everything else to drop off soft. And it created this very impressionistic image because that sliver of focus is so small that everything else blurs. The other option is to completely defocus. So this is literally where you will take your camera, you can focus in, and then I will normally put the focus. So these three ducks, they were coming across. The light wasn't really anything special. It was an overcast day, but I liked the formation of the ducks. You know, they were in this nice little triangle, set of three, and they had some nice color. The ducks themselves. So what I decided to do was I focused on this front one, put it in manual focus, and then defocus just slightly to put everything out of focus. Here's another one. This is probably the newest image out of this whole presentation. This was shot just a few weeks ago here in Texas. During we're just at the tail end of our bluebonnet season, the famous Texas bluebonnets, which are a type of lupine. So, but this image is probably one of my favorite from the season so far, because I just loved how you have this big oak tree coming out and branching over this field of bluebonnets. And to me, when I shot it sharp, it was still a little bit too busy, a bit too crunchy for what I felt when I was standing there. So I wanted to pass on kind of more of the emotional aspect of the scene, where it's just this very soft, it's a field of flowers under this dreamy oak. I don't need to see every leaf. For me, it's more about the structure of the tree and the color swath of flowers across the ground. So here I intentionally defocused to create this image. And this isn't just for landscapes or macro. You can also do it with wildlife. We saw the ducks. Here's a fox where I was shooting in Hokkaido, Japan, northern Japan. And it was one fox. We were out there. It was me and the fox in the middle of a blizzard on a frozen lake. And there was just this sense of just being completely enveloped by snow and out there and basically alone. And the fox paused, looking over its shoulder. I don't know if maybe it thought it heard something through the snow. Its hearing by far better than mine. But it kind of paused in this situation, in this posture. And I thought, by using defocus, I'm able to capture the emotion of it looking, if we want to anthropomorphize it, looking kind of worried and, small and within the snow, kind of just all alone, and bringing out that emotion that I felt while photographing it. I thought the defocus kind of really worked here in doing that and capturing that, because we know it's a fox. We automatically connect. There's enough there to let you know that it's a fox. But by defocusing it, you're making it feel further away. You make it feel enclosed in its own bubble. You have this sheet of snow in between the viewer and the fox. And so it just gives the image a bit different emotion than if I had just shot it tack sharp. So going back to kind of combining techniques, here I've combined defocus and doing the circular series like we saw earlier. So instead of having all those lines from it being sharp, now we're dealing with all these little kind of almost like brush, in an impressionistic painting, it would be the little dots of paint. Because I defocused, making the flowers kind of more rounded points, but then working it in the circular series and doing a whole series of them. So here we have two different ones, again, taken one right after another in that series. So I know this is a lot of words, considering we've just been looking at a lot of different images. I'm going to be talking about double and multiple exposure. So I just wanted to put up here kind of a quick, this is not a fully comprehensive list, but these are kind of the common camera bodies that have the capability to do double or multiple exposure within the camera. Okay, so hopefully you see your camera up here. If not, what I would say is refer to your owner's manual and see if yours does have multiple or double exposure options. And I know I need to add on here, we've got some of the mirrorless. I've been trying to update it as more and more mirrorless bodies come out. So if you shoot mirrorless, you may or may not see yours up here. All right. But that being said, I think that doing in-camera multiple exposure stacking can net you some really interesting and very beautiful impressionistic images. So it's certainly worth playing with. It's certainly something that you should look into based on your camera body. And so with this image, this was a 10 image shot. Because I shoot the Nikon D500, I can choose to do between 2 and 10 images that it will then stack for me into a single file in camera. So when using image stacking in camera, what you're going to do is you're going to set your settings, your exposure settings, so that you're taking a sharp image. The impressionistic, the kind of fuzzying of it comes from as you add layers, as you take one image after the other, you move slightly, keeping your subject in basically the same position within the frame, but just slightly off. So that's why you can see that there's petals out to either side and above and below, because I wanted to keep these flowers within the same area of the frame each time I took the image. But in doing so, each time I would take it just slightly off, either to the left, to the right, just a bit above or below from my initial start point. So that when all the images were stacked, you get this very dreamy image where you have the detail, but it's still blurred because of all those images stacking and kind of creating this multiple exposure on top of each. So hopefully that makes sense. Here's another one. This was only about six images stacked. Again, I liked the color combination between the green leaves and the blue sky, but there weren't any clouds in the sky. There wasn't really anything interesting going on with it. There wasn't a breeze. So I was trying to introduce some more interest other than just having some green leaves and a blue sky. So I thought that by doing a multiple image exposure and stacking them, it would give detail to the whole image and interest throughout the image while layering those two colors and giving it that good color contrast. And for those without in-camera features that allow for double or multiple, you do have the option of doing post-production using something like Photoshop to layer images over one another. And this can also be very useful to those who may only have like a double or triple exposure option and want more layers. You can do it in say, Photoshop. So definitely something that can be worked around if you don't have the in-camera options. You would just then take a series of 6 or 10 images and then use post to go in and layer them. All right, so we have our techniques, our intentional camera movement, long exposures, multiple exposures, selective focus, and defocus. Now, it's about getting out in the field and finding subjects. So what subjects make the best subjects for this type of work? Well, really everything from vast landscapes to the macro world. And I think we've seen quite a few images of that. But potential subjects are what you're going to want to look for is going to be things like color, repeating patterns, lines, both structural and light, areas of texture, and movement. And what I call the 3 W's, the water, wind, and wildlife. So colors, I think I heard that you're going to have a presentation later in a month or so on color theory in photography. Such a highly important subject to know because colors are what attract us to so many things in nature. So understanding why certain colors work with others and what emotions are tied to those can really help bring your work to life and make it more attractive to viewers. So colors you want to look for are going to be complementary colors, your reds and greens, your oranges and blues, or analogous colors, which are going to be your colors that are right next to each other on the color wheel. So orange, orange, yellow, green, that sort of thing. So here we have complementary colors, red and green. This is on the macro level. This was using tulips, part of a COVID project I was working on. Like so many of us, we all had COVID projects, right? Here we have the analogous colors. You know, we go from red to orange, yellow, and into green, you know, covering that portion of the color wheel rather than the colors that are across from each other, which is what the complementary colors. Repeating patterns, so things like wildflowers. Again, this is from that series that I did of defocus and circular snaps, but using patterns within nature. Here's another one. This was dappled light on a pond in the shade in spring. So the light was still filtering through the trees, and so you just get these kind of patterns of light, light green, dark green, and some blues. These can, if you do portraiture work or if you do other work where you go ahead and replace backgrounds with textures, this can be a great way to create your own texture, your own backgrounds as well. So, you know, you may not like these as standalone images, but they can still, you know, these techniques can help you bolster your other work that you use as well. So areas of texture, when I say areas of texture, you know, this was just kind of one of the bushes you see outside of, you know, out in the desert in Nevada, Arizona. It's like a mesquite or maybe an iron plant. But it's kind of one of these just kind of very crunchy bushes, but I love them because they have this texture to them. And so finding a way to photograph them can be awfully hard because if you just take the picture, they're just kind of blah. So I liked the texture on them. So that's what I shot for. Here's another one where I love the layers of texture. This was spring in the Tetons, and there was just these willow reeds with the trees that had their spring buds on them. It was just layer after layer of texture. Again, shot in the traditional manner, it's just chaos. Many would say this is still chaos, but to me, this is a better representation of the chaos in a more visually appealing manner, using kind of the impressionistic look. Structural lines, we all know of leading lines being a fundamental thing to have within landscape images, but structural lines, things like, you know, within the landscape, you have your structural lines within foliage, tree trunks. Here, again, we have the bamboo. Using those lines and letting them dictate how you shoot a scene for an impressionistic piece, for an abstract work. Structural lines here, these were actually sandstone fins within the Devil's Garden in Arches National Park. The blue you see is the sky behind them. This was shot midday. Actually, I was rather lazy about this one. I didn't even bother to get out of my RV. I shot this straight from the driver's seat, using a 400 millimeter lens, using the 18-400. I saw this where I saw the sandstone fins coming together with that sliver of sky, and I love the color contrast between them. And so I used a vertical panning with the fins to create this image. It's my favorite image that I captured from Arches National Park, and yet nobody would ever know unless told that this was taken there. Light lines. When I say light lines, I'm talking about lines that are created by the contrast between light and shadow. So this was taken in Red Rock, just outside of Las Vegas. It's going to be the Red Rock Canyon recreational area, national recreational area, something like that. I just know it as Red Rock. So, but you have the mountainous areas coming up behind, which gives it this magenta here. This was at sunrise. The sun was coming up and it was just kissing the tops of these areas, which are, you know, rolling kind of the topography of the area. And so it was outlining and shading areas within the topography, giving it these leading lines. Here's another one, sand dunes, playing with shadow and light. And using a bit of intentional camera movement to just smooth them out just slightly. Moving into my 3Ws, you have water. So water reflections, especially again, fall foliage, you find them reflecting and you shoot just the reflection, allowing the reflection to take on this very abstract look. Now here we also combined it with a little bit of wind rippling the top of the water, giving it an even more abstract look. But here, this is again from that Colorado shoot that I showed earlier. And what I've done with this is this was actually shot horizontally, like the one we saw before. But personally, I liked the color gradient when it was stood on end. And so now, as the artist, I present this image vertically, even though in nature it was shot horizontally, which is another, you know, that's up to the artist to decide. With these being as abstract as they are, you have the choice as to how you're going to present it. You know, I could have easily put the black strip, which is actually the shadowed canyon wall. I could have easily put that on the bottom and nobody would be the wiser. But for me, this is how I like to present it. Many people think it's a waterfall, but really it's the Colorado River, and then I just turned it on its side. And I don't know if I just spent too much time as a kid looking up at clouds, but I also love finding images within water. So I do these long exposures and I do a whole bunch of them. And then when I'm sitting down at the computer, the ones that draw me in the most are the ones that I really kind of see something in, you know, beyond just the colors and the ripples and the, you know, and the lines. So here on the left, this darker image, I actually see two things. You either kind of have like this rabbit, where on the left-hand side, you kind of see the head and the ear and the body's kind of going back towards that upper right-hand corner with the little leg coming down. But what a lot of people see, and I actually saw second, is they almost see like a shy horse, where instead of seeing the rabbit, that's more like the hair, the fetlock coming down in front of the horse, and this kind of reddish purple, where this is actually just a rock. But the reddish purple is kind of the eye, and the horse is kind of turned away. So a lot of people, including Google, by the way, you know, when Google gives you suggestions on how, you know, the subtext for your images, if you've ever looked at that, they actually said a horse for this one. So I was kind of proud of that. I tricked Google. Because what this really is a river in Sedona, Arizona. And again, long exposure, and I turned it from a horizontal to a vertical. Then we move to this other image, the brighter image here on the right, and I see a rat. So I actually titled this one River Rat, because I see it, you know, you have the nose, you have the body, and then the body kind of goes out of the image and the tail comes back in. I just thought that was a really fun image to find when looking through images from a fall foliage trip. Wind movement, much like water movement, if you've got a very windy day and you've got something like flowers or fall foliage, it can be really fun to see what you get if you set your camera up on a tripod and do a couple long exposures. Here, this was a field of lupine in the Palouse region of Washington, and we had wind kind of gusting through. And so I set my tripod up and just decided I was going to do some long exposures and see what I could do. Well, these are a little bit shorter than what I what I've termed long exposure at a half second. So this is a 20th of a second. And this was at a 1/6 of a second. So by changing how long I exposed for, allowed for more wind movement. And so again, making sure that you're playing with it enough so that, because I actually ended up liking this one a bit better. There's a little bit more structure to the flowers and a lot more color to me than, than here. Here you lose pretty much all the structure of the flowers themselves, and you don't actually get as much of the purple. You see a lot more of the green, the grasses. So I actually preferred this one, which is a bit shorter of a shutter speed than the longer one in this case. And then wildlife. Wildlife's constantly moving, and I shoot a lot of wildlife in the traditional style. But every once in a while, much like the birds at Mosquet, I really like trying to use kind of the more impressionistic and panning with them, because like bison for me are very hard to photograph. They're dark, they're big, they're lumbering. They don't really do a whole lot other than eat. And so how do you capture the power, the movement of them? Well, one time when I was visiting Yellowstone, this bull had kind of lagged behind and was catching up. And so as he's running across, I decided I was going to pan with him. And it really kind of gives this impression of exactly how fast they can move and the power that they bring with them as they are moving. Or here where I was photographing stellar sea eagles in Hokkaido, Japan in the winter. They overwinter there from Russia. And these eagles, they're larger than the bald eagles. They're one of the largest eagles on the planet. And they come and they fish. So I go out on a boat in the mornings, and I was able to capture this eagle fishing as it's coming down, about to hit the water. And it's done where the eagles will bring their wings back to kind of break themselves before they hit the water. And I captured that with a 1/15 of a second. And so I was able to get that kind of upward movement of the wing to show that power, to show that break action that the eagle is doing. Or here with the endangered red-crowned cranes, this bird had just come into land and was stretching its wings, which is something that they'll sometimes do upon landing. And by doing a longer exposure, 1/8 of a second, every time it would kind of stretch and pause, stretch and pause, stretch and pause as it worked its wings up, it would create this impression on the image that I was photographing. But you don't necessarily have to travel to Yellowstone or Japan to do it. You can do it with, wildlife in your own backyard. Even captive animals, such as these koi in a pond. I was shooting from a bridge at my local botanical garden. I heard you all talking about your local botanical garden. And those are amazing places to photograph, especially using things like they offer a whole opportunity for impressionistic work. But here, the one that I have back home in Florida, where my parents live, I was visiting them, and we went to the gardens, and by standing on the bridge and photographing the koi coming up, I love the impressionistic, the yin yang here with the two fish coming together. It was a bright blue day, and that blue light from the sky was reflecting on top of the water, giving it this blue hue. So some tips for pre-visualizing your images. The things you're going to want to ask yourself when taking images, when going out and looking for subjects that you want to use these techniques on, is what is it about the scene that creates an impression for you? Does the subject self-direct towards a specific technique, i.e., in the bamboo forest, it wouldn't have really made a whole lot of sense for me to do horizontal panning when all of the lines within the bamboo forest are vertical. When you've got sand dunes with shadows and they're horizontal. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to go vertical with it. So, do I need to actually be panning and moving the camera when working with a river, or can I just do a long exposure? And do you want the colors or details within the image to blend or stay apart from each other? And that's going to direct you to how fast you're going to move the camera, or in which direction, you're going to move the camera. So, and what method might help accentuate the impression you're trying to capture? So, with the bison moving, I really wanted to capture that power, that speed, because a lot of people think of them as just, big, slow things, which we all know that they aren't. But, so how do I capture that speed, that power? So in that case, I wanted to do the panning because it would help bring that, what I was trying to express visually out. So other things to look for are going to be things like soft curves, complementary colors, and the way the light falls on your subject. So those were the things I was looking for in this particular image of a tulip. In this image, I tried selective focus. This was a bunch of like these billowy, soft looking grasses out in the desert. It was kind of late in summer, so everything was kind of crispy, but these were just kind of billowy and soft looking. And I tried selective focus and it did not work. As you can tell, it did not work at all. So then I decided I would try the intentional camera movement. And instead of just going either vertically or horizontally, I moved the camera with the direction of the grass stems. And to me, this gave a better representation of the texture that and that feeling of the kind of soft, billowy. It doesn't really say grass, but it still has that kind of soft feel to it. And for me, that was enough. And so this is the better image to me of the two by far. Or trees in winter. So I know that you all are still within the grasps of winter, it seems. And so maybe this is something that you could look for. But I visited Yosemite in late winter, and the trees were barren. And I went through Yosemite and I saw tunnel view and everything like that, but these were the images that I was most drawn to. So in here I used 1/15 of a second. I used a very small amount of intentional camera movement with a vertical pan, just enough to actually bring out more layers of these little branches and kind of bring out more of those details by shifting them slightly within the image. So kind of doubling up, if you will, while keeping the tree trunks straight. And then I did this same stand of trees. I started a little bit lower so I'd get the snow in the foreground, but I used 1/10 of a second and I moved my camera much, much faster. So we went from all of this detail here to a much smoother wintry forest. Two very different images, two very different feels, the feelings that you get from them. Both say winter, but this one almost seems a bit more inviting. At least to me, this one seems a bit more inviting, a bit more kind, whereas this is a bit more harsh, like the reality of winter, the barren trees and kind of the clutter. And yeah, so same spot, same trees, two different techniques. Okay, so we have our techniques. I've shown you kind of where and what subjects might work for the various techniques. So what do you do with your photos when you get them home? Because you're going to come home with a lot of images, which is a good thing. It takes a little bit to cull through them, but I think you can really find some really great images with it when you're playing with it. So the biggest thing is obviously shoot raw for easier and less destructive editing. I typically do very minimal processing on my images, just enough to focus on the subject. With these images, you really want to play with those kind of clarity and contrast sliders. Increasing the exposure if you've had to shoot underexposed due to the required shutter speed or having a slower lens. And probably the biggest thing with any of these is make sure you remove your dust spots. I'm sure going through this presentation, I know it seems every time I go through it, I see one or two more on some of the slides, but make sure you remove your dust spots, because your images, that is going to be the one thing that does not move. So if you have this really creamy, dreamy image, because you were using intentional camera movement or a long exposure or defocusing, you're going to see those dust spots because they did not move, they did not defocus. And so they will stand out on these images almost more than any other image in your collection. So be sure to remove dust spots. And here's just some examples of what the before and after were. So obviously this was well underexposed. It was a hand-holding situation late in the day, but I loved the colors, so I took the shot anyways. I didn't clip my blacks, and I certainly didn't blow out highlights, so I was able to recover. Should you do it? It's up to you. I really like the colors, so I went ahead and pushed this one to bring up the exposure on it. And here you can see the before and after of that Yosemite winter tree scape. So I did have to bring up the exposure. I increased the contrast a bit. I brought down the shadows because when I brought up the exposure, I had to put some of those shadows back in to give it that depth. And I increased the clarity. That's all I did. Everything else stayed the way it was when it was shot. Though I did remove dust spots. Or here, this was another image from the Colorado River where I really liked how the water looked like it was this braided, it was just these braids of water with color. And so the exposure came up just a bit, contrast came up just a bit. I really threw the clarity slider because I really wanted to bring in those details within the water that showed kind of that braided look that I was wanting to capture. So I brought the clarity all the way up. And then I brought vibrance and saturation up as well. Because while I don't typically use those very much in any of my other images, for my impressionistic work, I will do it because, again, it's what I'm trying to capture. What is it about the scene, and pushing it more in a fine art rather than a realism type direction. So to kind of summarize everything, there's a lot of techniques out there to try. Your settings are going to vary, but shutter speed is usually the primary control. Using aperture and ISO to balance out your exposure triangle to get that shutter speed at the level that you want it to, however slow you want to get. Subjects can be found almost anywhere. And while all gear, you can use all gear, I typically find mid to long variable telephoto lenses to be best. Digital is cheap. Take a ton of images and then find what works for you, what you enjoy. Because really at the end of the day, this is all about having fun with photography, breaking the rules, thinking outside the box, and just getting out there and seeing what you can create. Some of the challenges that I have for you, if you want to take them on, would be spend an hour with a flower or an overactive pet, see how many images you can find. Or take a 16 gigabyte card out and don't come back until it's full. Depending on how many images you shoot, that could be, you know, you're only out for an hour, or it could be you're out for half a day. Find a scene, choose your settings, and see how many different images you can create just by changing your speed or the direction of your intentional camera movement. That one is one that I really suggest. If you like intentional camera movement, that's one that I really highly suggest doing, because that way you can learn exactly how fast you need to move it and kind of get the muscle memory for the physical movement of your camera, because it's never going to be exactly the same, but it can be close, and you'll start to understand the relationship between how fast you move the camera and how smooth of an image you get. So with that, I thank you all so very much once again for having me. And I hope you've enjoyed this. I would love to open it up for questions. You can find my work on my website, abenderphotography.com. And you can sign up for my monthly newsletter, which I send out a monthly article, also upcoming events and any new images at abenderphotography.com/subscribe. You can also find me on Instagram at abenderphoto. And a special shout out to Tamron for their sponsorship and support, and for allowing me to bring this to you all. So I'd love to open it up to any questions at this time.
Hey, thank you, Alyce. What I'll do is I will go ahead and start with a few of the questions that we have, and then I'll go through a couple of the complimentary comments and some of the other things that I came up with. But I'll go through a couple of the ones that came up in the chat here real quickly. Let's see here. I'll just read them from this. The first one was Randy Lawrence asked, how do you choose the ISO settings?
So ISO is normally something that I choose kind of last. The D500 is well known for its capabilities to handle higher ISOs with limited to no noise, as well as low light. So I don't really worry about my ISO too much. I easily start at 800 and not really think about it, at all. So for me, ISO is going to be the last thing I choose, but I would say, again, play with it. It's going to depend, if you're shooting in the forest, if you're shooting in the desert, if you're shooting bright sunlight or overcast, it's going to, change depending on that. And it's going to change depending on your camera, but, set it at ISO, 800 and go from there. If your camera typically handles 800, okay.
And probably, I would guess you're first of all, in this type of photography, you're mostly concerned about shutter speed and exposure. And so you're coming up with those and then solving for the equation of ISO.
Right. And that's exactly it. I know where, my main primary is going to be that shutter speed, whether I want it at a 1/6 of a second, a 20th of a second, whatever I want that shutter speed at, that's going to be my primary. And then I'm going to look to aperture, and then I'm going to look to ISO to fill in the equation.
Right. And kind of along those lines too, Kathy Sneed asked the question, do you use a neutral density filter to allow for more shooting time?
Typically I don't, because a lot of times this is something I do to kind of fill time in between my other, if I'm out doing wildlife, between my traditional shots, either wildlife or landscape or macro, I just kind of do these to fill time. But that's not saying you can't, because a neutral density filter is a wonderful way to darken a scene down so that you can get a longer exposure. So, maybe in some of those instances where I was at something like f/29, I may not have had to go that far if I just put a neutral density filter So that's certainly a tool that you can use. And I do use neutral density filters in other areas of my photography. So it's not that I don't have them. It's just normally this is something I do to fill the time between traditional shots.
Great, great. And then I hope I get the name right here. Yi Sui asked the question. Let's see here, and kind of again in regards to these last two questions.
Right.
He asks for long exposure. How do you compare the neutral density plus a larger aperture instead of small f-stop? Which is better and why?
I think again, it goes down to what am I shooting around doing this? You know, when doing the long exposure, especially working around water, I do have a polarizer on automatically, because even if I'm shooting traditional landscape, I'm going to have a polarizer on if I'm shooting around water. So I'll have that on. So a lot of times then I do put the neutral density filter on if I have the forethought to do it. Otherwise, I just will, you know, kind of tighten down on that aperture to darken it down that way. So I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer there. I think it's personal preference as to what you want to do. For me, again, like I said, I do these for fun in between, which, you know, when waiting for the traditional shot to come along. So for me, a lot of times it's just easier to push to, you know, f/22 and a low ISO and go from there.
Okay. And then another question just popped in. Joe
Sure.
Banquet, he asks, when doing a 10-shot multiple exposure, do you have to underexpose each image so the final image isn't too dark?
No, so at least in my camera, again, this goes back to knowing your gear and looking at that owner's manual. In mine, it averages each image together. So I have the option to either go high, low, or average. So it'll either go for the brights, the darks, or it goes for the average exposure. And so I just keep it on that average, and I find that it gives me normally a very well exposed final image even after those 10 have been stacked.
Okay. And no more questions. Most of it is just a couple comments on how much everybody enjoyed the presentation and that. So I'll jump over to a couple of things that I had in here. And that, first of all, I was going to echo that part of it, is that I'm so glad we had a really good, strong audience tonight, because this really was amazing. Everything that you presented there.
Well, thank you so very much. I really hope, you know, especially with COVID kind of keeping us more local, this gives us a new way to look at the things around us and to play with cameras, and really kind of get outside the box, get those creative juices flowing. So.
Yeah. And the other comment that I jotted down here real quick while I was just kind of, as I was watching this, is, you know, what almost everything that you did there is with equipment that most of us already have. You know, a lot of times we attend presentations and that, and it's like, oh yeah, you could do this if you spend another $1,500 on gear for this, that, and the other thing. But this, most of this is essentially things that we already have. It's just a matter of getting those creative juices flowing and experimenting with these other techniques and that. So
yeah, I mean, I'm not a techie type person. I don't like having to have a bunch of gear with me, and a lot of doodads or accessories, or, you know, I like keeping it simple. And so I really think that as creative and as unique as these images can be, it doesn't take, you don't have to have any special gear. It's, you know, even with the filters, you know, you don't have to have filters. There's a workaround for that. You know, so that's one thing, that's why I like bringing this sort of thing to a lot of clubs, because this is not going to take, you know, oh, you need to go out and invest another $1,200 in gear unless you wanted to. You know, you can use these lenses, you can use similar lenses, but, you know, I used everything from 10 to 600 millimeters here. We all have something in them.
Right. Yeah, no, I thought that was really impressive. And then, you know, what I like too is I jotted down that, you know, I mean, you brought up like some locations in that we're all familiar with, whether it's, you know, Yosemite, and I think you had some from Arches and so forth. and the creativity that you came away with those images at those locations where we're all so used to seeing, kind of those iconic landscape scenes or whatever in that. But it's amazing to show what you can find at some of those locations that are beautiful, but just like not what something out of the ordinary that we're not typically used to seeing.
Right, right. Yeah. And I do that because, again, I enjoy it, but also because I like showing that you don't have to go for that iconic shot. You can come away with something of your own.
Right, right. And unique, right. Something very unique at that. So.
And it's not, even if I have somebody standing shoulder to shoulder with me, shooting the same technique, especially with the intentional camera movement, we're all moving slightly different. So no one is coming home with the same image. Might have some similar images, but not the exact same image. You're not, I've seen people out there with, the screenshot on their cell phone, and they're trying to align their camera just perfectly to get the exact same shot as what they see on Instagram. You can't do that with these. These are individual. These are getting into that fine art and very creative photography. So.
Yeah. No, they truly are amazing. And then the last thing I jotted down here was I like your challenges that you set up there at the end. So it's something for all of us to go out and experiment with. And the one that resonated with me, you said if you have a overactive pet, and I've got one about 10 feet away from me here, so he will get some he will get some camera exposure here in the next.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mine absolutely hate the camera at this point. They suddenly simmer down when I pull it out. So they don't feel like being on that side of the camera any more than I do. But I know a lot of people, and it could be, you have kids, grandkids, whatever, if you've got something overactive that's moving, you can practice those movement ones. But yeah, so I hope that some of you all will take up some of those challenges, and feel free if you post them on Instagram or something, go ahead and tag me in them, because I always like seeing what people decide to do with information from webinars like this. So.
And then that was, I think, it for the questions, unless somebody else wants to, and feel free to unmute yourself if anybody else wants to bring anything up. But most of the other items that are here in the chat room are, they keep piling up here of great information, and everybody really enjoyed it. And I think everybody found a lot of inspiration out of it in terms of it gives us other opportunities to go out and use our existing gear and create something of that's addition that's so interesting in that, similar to what you've provided us with. So again, great inspirational.
There was one other question. How did you become a Tamron ambassador?
Oh, good question. And that one's kind of hard for me to answer because they approached me. So I don't have the full backstory. I just know that I've worked with their gear. I continuously tag them in every post that I have on Instagram. And I was teaching at my local camera store in Las Vegas, and their rep came in to one of my presentations. And I talked with him after, nothing. It wasn't like, oh, we'd be interested in having you. No, it was just kind of general shop talk. And then, a few months later, they asked if I wanted to send in stuff to the magazine. I did. They published that, and I guess they got the views of the upper management, and they then offered to bring me on board. So I'm not quite sure how it happened. I'm just very honored that it did, because they're a great company. So I love their product. So.
Yeah. That's great. And I have, I was going to say, I have, I think 3 or 4 Tamron lenses, and that's kind of my go-to equipment oftentimes. And the one that you referenced there a few times there was that 150 to 600. And that's my go-to for a lot of my, well, I'll say wildlife, but now I see there's a lot of other applications.
That's my baby. I mean, that's on my camera more than pretty much anything else, is that 150 to 600 G2. Yes, I do a lot with it with wildlife, but I've been doing more and more landscapes with it as well, getting into the abstract, getting into the small scenes, the distant scenes, that sort of thing. So there's a lot that can be done with it. It's not just a wildlife.
Great,
Um,
thank you very much.
I just want to put out there that if anybody does go out, they're practicing this or trying this, or they're reviewing this and they do come up with questions, please feel free to reach out to me in the future. Send me an email, contact me on my website, however you want to do it, social media, and I will get back with you just as soon as I can. You know, I'm not going to leave you hanging on that. So if you do come up with any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank
great.
you all.
Thanks again. So yeah, we'll let you go on with your evening and unless anybody else has any other questions. But like I say, most of it was just complimentary comments that were coming in there towards the end. So again, very much appreciate your time. And
Great.
this was a great presentation.
Thank you all so very much. And I hope you all have a great night.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks, Alyce.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.